All right, getting some folks joining here. Welcome, everyone. Let's see where we're at. So while we're gonna give it a minute for everyone who clicked join right at noon to get on here, and then we'll get started. Kind of waiting for the attendee number to settle out. In the meantime, so we'll get this going officially in a minute here. If folks want to introduce themselves, say where they're from or where they're joining from today, feel free to add that in the chat. That's always kind of a fun way to interact on webinars, to see where folks are calling in from. All right, well, we might as well just get started. So, welcome everyone. My name is Kendra Collins. I am the relatively new Director of Forest Programs here at the Northern Forest Center. Since there's plenty of new names on the attendee list for me, just a quick means of introduction. So I joined the center team in early January after about a 17-year career with the American Chestnut Foundation. So I worked primarily in single species restoration across New England, and also directed our regional programs across like the whole native range of the American chestnut. So the Northern Forest is a little bit more manageable size piece of region, I guess. Anyway, we really appreciate you all joining today for our webinar series. Just a bit of housekeeping. The webinar is recorded. We're in webinar mode, so we can't see you, we can't hear you. Feel free to listen and go about your day as you wish. If the dog starts barking, it's fine. We can't hear it. The ways to interact will be any comments or notes you'd like to add during the presentations, feel free to put those in the chat. We do ask that you put questions in the Q&A so we can keep track of them. It's a lot easier to keep track of questions in the Q&A feature so that we don't lose track of those by the time we get to that portion of our program. This webinar is part of our Building the New Forest Future series, and it's designed to amplify stories, practices, and lessons from community development, sustainable tourism, and the forest economy within the Northern Forest. Really appreciate you all joining us today for our discussion on programs that incentivize landowners to deploy forest management practices to increase carbon sequestration and storage. We'll discuss what these programs are the cost share programs to voluntary carbon markets, from commercial landowners to small scale family forests. And our panelists will discuss how these programs work and what's next for them. So I'll have each of our panelists introduce themselves, but just as a preview, we are joined today by Dan Hohl, who is the Commercial Lands Forester with the New England Forestry Foundation, Jim Shallow, who is Director of Resilient and Connected Lands with the Nature Conservancy, and Tim Stout, who's a landowner with Jockey Farm and also runs Northam Forest Carbon. So we'll kind of hear from each of those guys. They'll share a little bit about their programs. We've got some questions for everyone that we'll discuss, and then we will also try to get to your questions from the Q&A. So please, as those come up for you, just add them on in, and hopefully we can get to everyone's interests by the time we wrap up around 1:30. So with that, Dan, would you like to introduce yourself and kick us off with a discussion of what you're doing with New England Forestry Foundation?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kendra. And real quickly, before I get into the introduction of who I am and what programs I'm sharing with you all today, I just want to say thank you to the Northern Forest Center for hosting this webinar. I'm very excited to be on the panel. This is actually one of the first panels I've ever had a chance to be on, and so I'm really excited. This looks like a really fun opportunity to share information about a few of the incentive programs that NEF is implementing throughout New England. So yeah, my name is Dan Hohl. I'm a forester with New England Forestry Foundation. I've been with the foundation for 1.5 years. Most of my early career was spent as a field forester, laying out timber sales. Now my work with New England Forestry Foundation focuses on designing and implementing climate smart forestry incentive programs. Another word for that could be like cost share programs. So we could think about these programs like um, cost sharing, climate smart forestry practices in New England. So I was hired to help with the USDA Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities grant that NEF received a couple years ago. That's a $30 million grant that NEF received, and it has a whole lot of different deliverables assigned to it. And today I'm only going to be talking about a few of those. That's our commercial landowner incentive program and our small forest landowner incentive program, which we refer to as GROW. About $12.5 million of that $30 million grant are allocated towards incentivizing climate smart forestry practices on the ground with landowners. So a good portion of that is actually to see those actions take place on the ground. So our GROW program, which stands for Grow Resilient Oak Hickory Forests, is really our small forest landowner incentive program. It's somewhat newly launched. It launched in December 6th of 2024, so it's been active for about 3 months. It's really the program aims to address challenges posed by a rapidly changing climate, including forest disturbances. You know, those things that we know we're going to be seeing more of as we continue to see the impacts of climate change play out on our forests. It helps woodland owners manage their forests for long-term climate resilience. This program is really focused on the climate resilience part of what climate smart forestry is. And the grant is for non-commercial practices. So it's really meant to enable those types of practices that would not be viable without some sort of subsidy. The program's eligible for woodland owners in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island. So although it's not really focused on the northern forests of New England, we did want to share it because I think that maybe folks listening can take a lot of parts of the program and apply them to what they're doing in northern New England, or maybe some folks on the call actually do get down to southern New England and can actually participate in this program or help spread the word even too. So woodland owners with at least 25 contiguous acres in Massachusetts and Connecticut can enroll in this program, and woodland owners with at least 10 forested acres in Rhode Island can enroll in this program. So the program reimburses landowners 70% of the costs to plan and conduct timber harvests on their land. So a lot of these practices that we're seeing are really designed around timber stand improvement, and again are generally these sort of non-commercial practices that we don't see these type of small forest landowners invest their own money in unless there's a little bit of a subsidy or cost share attached to that. On the other side of what we're doing with the commercial landowners, we have about 10.6 million allocated towards incentivizing practices with commercial landowners. The commercial landowner definition for our purposes is actually just anybody who has 10,000 acres or more of forest land in their portfolio. So it doesn't matter if you're a private landowner, if you're a municipality, if you're a state public entity, as long as you have 10,000 acres or more, you're eligible to enroll in our program. It's not available for federal landowners because these are federal funds, and the 30% cost share that the landowner brings has to be from some sort of private financing. It can't be from federal sources. That's why federal lands are not eligible. So similar to our GROW program, the program is incentivizing climate smart forestry practices. It does focus on forest adaptation and resilience, but here it also really incentivizes and emphasizes that we need to increase carbon storage in the forests and in wood products. So again, we pay 70% of the cost to implement the climate smart forestry practice on their land. And we are looking to enroll 40,000 acres through the course of our grant with commercial landowners in northern New England. And I know we're going to get more into these programs later on, so I'll leave my introduction there and pass it off to the next panelist.
Great. Thank you, Dan. That was great. Jim, I think you're up next. If you'd like to introduce yourself, that would be lovely.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Shallow, and I'm the Director of Resilient Connected Lands in the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy. I'm going to show a few slides. Today, I'm going to be talking about the Family Forest Carbon Program that we've developed in partnership with the American Forest Foundation. And it's a way to enable smaller landowners to access the financing that's available through carbon markets to improve the management of their land so that those trees that they have are storing and sequestering more carbon that we need. So I'm going to share my presentation here. Right. So as a global organization, the Nature Conservancy has committed itself to addressing the twin crises we have of the warming climate and a loss of biodiversity. And what we found through our science is that nature can play a big role in addressing our climate goals by removing and storing carbon. And in fact, about a third of what we need to do to get to that target of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius that we set in the Paris Accords can be met by what we call nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions. These are ways to have nature play a role. So, you know, we can protect more forests here in northern New England. In the northern forest states, the Nature Conservancies can help protect over 1 million acres of land across the 4 states that we're working in. We can restore more forests, so doing reforestation of like floodplain areas, old farm areas. But today I wanted to talk about managing timberlands better. So by changing management practices so that we're storing more carbon, sequestering carbon, we think we can get to a big chunk of what we need to do. And that's where these markets come into play, where voluntary carbon markets provide financing to do this kind of work. But as yet, globally, only about 2% of the money going into addressing climate change is going into nature-based solutions. So the markets are an important part of that. But in doing this, you know, the markets are emerging. They're dynamic at this point, but they've largely targeted larger properties. So what we know here in New England, and this is true nationally, is that family forest landowners are a key to this solution. About, you know, 40% of the land in the United States is owned in family forests. Here in our region, it's much higher. About 80% of the region is privately owned. And I can speak for Vermont, about 80% of the privately owned land is in small family ownership. So they're really an important audience for working with to meet these big climate goals that we have as a planet. And yet they've been locked out of these markets. The markets are helping keep these forests healthy, but you need big tracts to be enrolled. Most of these are 1,000 acres or more. That doesn't fit our landowner profile here in most of the northern forest states. And the reason for that is that the projects to date to develop them are complex. You need to have inventories done, you need to have modeling done, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have to monitor those out over a 40-year to 100-year commitment. So that has been a barrier to entry for a lot of landowners in this region. So TNC and the American Forest Foundation saw this as a need, and so we got together to develop the Family Forest Carbon Program. Its goal is to help family owners in improving forest health and addressing climate change. We have a big audacious goal of having 20% of the family forest acres enrolled in this program by 2030 in order to store and sequester at least 50 million tons of additional CO2 equivalents annually. And we want to do that while improving forest health, wildlife habitat, water quality, and recreational space. So we think that there's a nice Venn diagram where all these things stack up well. And our goal is to develop this program that can provide services for landowners. So provide the funding to address those practices that oftentimes aren't cost effective because maybe you're removing trees that aren't of high quality, but you're doing it to improve future forest stands. And that just doesn't bring in a lot of income for the loggers and the landowner themselves. So we're going to find ways to provide funding for incentives and then give landowners the support and access to professionals like foresters and others to help them develop management plans and do the site visits and develop those plans. And then ultimately have sustainability built in so that we have the benefits of forest management that's improving wildlife habitat like bird habitat, protecting water resources by adding buffers or doing wood additions to streams, things like that is all part of the engagement with the landowners. So the program was modeled or piloted in the Central Appalachians, and we rolled it out here in Northern New England about 3 years ago this coming summer. To be eligible for the program, you have to have at least 30 acres minimum that you can enroll. The majority of that has to be in a naturally occurring northern hardwood forest. So that's think of like maple, beech, birch, ash, that kind of forest that we think about that light up the hillsides every fall. The stands that are enrolled need to be able to be commercially harvested or have a stocking level where they can be harvested in the next 20 years. And there can be no legal restrictions on timber harvesting. So it needs to be like free and clear and able to harvest according to the laws of the state that you are, where your land is. So we've developed a couple practices that landowners can enroll in, and they pay at different rates. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the Grow Older Forest. These are 20-year contracts for both these practices. The Grow Older Forest pays $300 an acre for that 20-year contract. It allows your forest stand to mature by delaying timber harvest for that 20-year period. You can do salvage logging if you have a big pest outbreak or there's a storm event. It also allows for personal firewood removal of up to 5 cords a year. And this is a really important caveat. This practice is generally not compatible with state forest land current use programs. There are some exceptions, and we can get into that maybe in the Q&A, but generally we're trying to tell people that are like, if you're in a current use program, don't start with this one. You may want to look at this next one, which is enhance your woodland. And this is one where you get paid to do the practices. Again, 20-year contract, $200 an acre in this instance. You need to have, as you're implementing these practices, you can't cut more than 15% of the basal area over the enrolled parcel over that 20-year period, and less than 25% of the basal area removed from a harvested area. So you might have an area that's being harvested, but if you're not cutting another part of the enrolled parcel, that's sort of how you work out those numbers. And then to avoid people from going in and cutting the best trees and all that, we have you can't have more than a 10% reduction of the quadratic mean diameter of the stand. So we want to make sure that you're not like going in and cutting all the big trees and just leaving the little ones there. You can do gaps up to 5 acres. And oops, I may have that wrong. Up to 5 acres or 20% of the harvested area can be in these gaps, and you need to have at least 250-foot buffers around the gaps. And then there's provisions for retaining dead wood and large trees within those gaps, and those are all spelled out in the specific provisions when you enroll. So how do you enroll as a landowner? So we've set this up to be as easy as possible for landowners. You can go to this familyforestcarbon.org website. You can go to a map and find your parcel, click on that. It'll tell you from a quick screening of whether the property is eligible or not. Sometimes that isn't quite accurate. So if you get like a rejection there, it might still be, and you think you've got a lot of hardwoods, it's worth reaching out to them. You'll speak to a representative about the specifics of your property. They'll connect you with a forester, or it could be your consulting forester if you already have one in place. they'll go out, we'll look at the property and come up with an estimate for the contract. You can review that contract. Once you sign it, you get a payment up front for that. And then you continue to work with the forester to develop the management plan. Within 1 year, you have to have that management plan in place or adapted to meet the new standards that you have. So it's fairly easy to do, but multiple steps involved in that. So we've been really excited about the uptake of this in New England here, nationally in this area that you see on the map. Currently, we have about 900 plus landowners enrolled in the program. That's 130,000 acres of land under commitments. We've committed $33 million out of those 20-year contracts. 6 million of that has been paid to date. Here in New England and New York, similar sort of uptake, 157 landowners are enrolled, 23,000 plus acres, and we've committed $6 million to the landowners, and $840,000 have been paid to date. We do have a climate smart commodities grant, which if you're willing to enroll in the NRCS programs, you can get an additional 20% on those practices. So pretty excited about all of this and happy to get into more questions as we go on, and happy to turn it over to my fellow panelists now.
Hey, Jim, before we move on, I'm actually going to ask you a quick question that just popped up in the Q&A because I know it's relevant to the program you just talked about.
Okay.
Mike Snyder is wondering, do you need a forester to come onto your land to participate, or can you do this yourself? I'm guessing maybe he's asking because he might be a forester. But
it's going to need to be reviewed. You could do it yourself, but it will be reviewed by an AFF forester or a TNC forester. They'll do a desktop review in many cases, and if they feel like it's adequate, and don't need to do the site visit, they probably won't come out and actually take a look at the property unless the landowner wants them out there.
Okay, awesome. Well, I opened a can of worms. We got a couple other questions coming in, so I'm going to hold on the rest of them until we get through Tim's presentation. But thank you guys for starting to pepper those into the Q&A. That's great. All right. Well, Jim, thank you.
Thank you.
And Tim, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself? And I know you've got some slides to share as well.
Yep.
Great.
Good afternoon, everyone on the call. It's again, thanks to the Northern Forest Center for hosting this, and great that Kendall and Kendra identified this as a key topic. My name is Tim Stout. I have two roles on this call. One, I'm a landowner down outside of Woodstock, Rutland, the Shrewsbury, Vermont area. I have about 175 acres there. And I also run a small nonprofit called Northam Forest Carbon, which is focused on bringing forest carbon to landowners, the whole forest carbon sequestration and storage, that concept to other landowners at a landowner level. So peer-to-peer, this is something I started about 6 years ago, and there's a lot of interest, and I try to meet that interest where people want to talk to another landowner who has actually participated in this program. So I'm going to slowly pull up my slides here. Can you see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Great.
Actually, you know what, Tim? We're having the same thing we did earlier where I'm not seeing the very bottom of your slide.
Okay.
Do you want to just try resharing one more time?
Let's see what happens here. Let me just. In fact, I think we can just go through and maybe that bar will evaporate.
All right, we'll give it a shot.
Here we go. Nope, it's still there. Okay.
I think we're good. I think we're seeing everything now. Yeah.
Okay, great. So let me go back here. What I'm going to be talking about is climate smart forestry practices at our farm. We've owned this farm for about 85 years. My great-grandfather owned it back in the 30s, and now we still maintain it pretty much as it was way back then. Our intent here is to look at this land from a forest carbon perspective. A totally new perspective to us. So I've managed this farm that you see here, and then further up in the woods, this is Shrewsbury Peak. Killington is right behind that. So this entire bowl is about 2,300 acres, and then there's another close to 20,000 acres of preserved land in the Calvin Coolidge Forest. So 6 years ago, I attended a presentation by Dr. Keaton at Bill Keaton at UVM on forest carbon. And it kind of opened my eyes, our family eyes, our neighbors' eyes to the fact that forest carbon, looking at our land from that angle, was a totally different perspective, because we're looking at how can all this forest become more and more of a carbon sink. So looking at this, it's a glorious carbon sink. And our perspective over the last 5 years, is what can we do to enhance that sink and build a resilient, diverse forest on this land, and then keeping in close touch with the state. So Forest Parks and Recreation, we work closely with, so we know what they're doing. They have a good sense of what we're doing at the farm, so it coincides. This is a little bit of background. This is where our farm is right now. This was the original house that burned down in 1976. But the land, as you can imagine, 100 years ago, this is almost all pasture. So it's a remarkable recovery. And we've got mixed hardwoods, about half mixed hardwoods, and then half pine, spruce, hemlock, balsam. The climate smart forestry practices that we're adopting, we're looking at managing forest carbon sequestration and storage, and I'll get into a little bit of what Jim talked about earlier. We're working with Tony D'Amato and others in the state on planting climate resilient trees with mixed results, promoting regeneration. So we have about 10 patch cuts on our land. Those done 30 years ago or 20 years ago are coming back beautifully. Those done in the last 10 years are threatened by lots of invasive plants. So we're controlling our invasive plants by the application of herbicides. We've got a NRCS grant over 3 years to treat our land for invasives. We're also looking at augmenting biodiversity. So as you saw in the first couple of pictures, that land, there's an amazingly diverse range of wildlife on that land. In fact, this year, we had our first lynx in my lifetime show up on our property, and then it slowly made its way up to Middlebury and beyond. But we have lots of moose, lots of bear, tons of deer, as you can imagine. So, then getting even more into biodiversity, looking at all of our bogs and wetlands on the property is a key part of what we're managing for. And then addressing flooding and erosion. One of the reasons we pursued the Family Forest Carbon Program was in the last 10 years, we've been hit really hard by climate change impacts. And they've been pretty significant, and I'll get into that in a little bit. And then we're doing some selective harvesting, thinning in the softwood and mixed hardwoods. So those are the practices. There are a bunch of others that are not on this list, but these are the big ones that we're looking at. It was fun to implement these. and to grab hold of them. We've always done harvesting, but fun to look at the perspective. And now we're into kind of the management phase. So how do you manage all those climate resilient trees? Kendra, through the American Chestnut Foundation, kindly gave us 50 hybrid chestnuts 3 years ago, and roughly 44 out of that 50 are thriving. But maintaining those, trying to keep up with what's required to pull this off is a great deal of work, and it is expensive. So that was one of the reasons we participated in the Family Forest Carbon Program and in NRCS grants to supplement our funds to do what we want to do with the land. The impacts that I mentioned before, you've seen this list, I'm sure, many times, but the lengthened growing season, of course, this winter isn't a normal winter for us right now. Those little chestnuts that Kendra gave us are surrounded by 3.5 feet of snow right now. We get really heavy snow up because we're on the south side of Killington. We have significant rain events, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but it's taking a lot of our topsoil off the land. You can see in this picture over here on the right, a lot of what you see is the white in the stream here. A lot of that wasn't there 5 years, 6 years ago. It's just massive erosion every year throughout our property. Fierce winds, so we're losing a lot of our trees. We have an area with 150 to 200-year-old maples. Those are being toppled by the winds, much more intense than what we've seen before. And then I mentioned before the invasive plants and insect species. We're fortunate not to have a whole lot of insects yet, but according to the state maps, they're coming for us, and we've got, as mentioned, lots of invasive plants. Why do we participate in the Family Forest Carbon Program? So as I mentioned, Dr. Keaton introduced this to us back in 2018. We then, my family and I and our forester, spent about 2 years exploring this in greater detail. We looked at various programs, and the Family Forest Carbon Program was the one we settled on. It's a big lift to participate because of the extensiveness of the contract. However, the program's, in our view, very, very well thought out. And I should also, in full disclosure, say that I'm on the board of directors of the American Forest Foundation. So I'm very, very immersed in the day-to-day operation of this program. Jim went over a lot of the stats here. It's growing pretty impressively, which is exciting now in about 19 states. Then why did we enroll? One was to build capacity of our land to adapt and mitigate climate change. With the intense climate impacts and then watching the land evolve over the last 40 years, we felt we needed to do more to manage the land, to get more funding to do what we want to do, and the technical expertise. So we have a lot of advisors on the land. We have our consulting forester, our county forester, various people. Jim Shallow has been involved, the UVM, UMass. So we call from many different entities to make sure that we're doing the right thing on the property. And it's been a really interesting evolution with the property. We also wanted to establish a forest carbon demonstration site. So one of the things that I do through Northam Forest Carbon is often lead field trips on the property for other landowners, accompanied by a forester or consulting forester or someone else who knows a great deal about forest carbon. And finally, another reason we participated, we are a very early adopter. We were one of the first families to get involved with the program, was to help AFF and the Nature Conservancy prove the viability of a forest carbon program. And to Jim's organization and to the credit of the American Forest Foundation, I think the integrity of this program is significant. It's very, very impressive. When Kendra and Kendall post the presentations, you can just go to these QR codes to get more information. Jim mentioned the website. I also have their blog, which has a lot of very interesting background on the program and what they're doing more here. And then, as I mentioned, we're very involved with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, both through their Conservation Stewardship Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which I won't get into much detail here as it would take up a fair amount of time, but we've gotten some very nice grants from NRCS to pursue climate smart forestry. The remainder of the slides will just touch on some of the things that we're doing on the property. All over that are 175 acres, and then some over in our neighbor's property, which together is about 400 acres. So we've planted about 400 climate resilient trees. We've got a batch of American chestnuts, as I mentioned earlier, hybrid chestnuts, a bunch of oaks, a lot of hickory, and various other species. We've had great success with some. We have a lot of deer and a few moose. So those trees it's been a huge undertaking to keep those trees surviving in the area that we're located in, but exciting to integrate these trees into our forest. This is a quick shot of how we integrated the trees into one of our fields. And I often get the question, well, why are you planting more trees? 90% of your land is forested. Why plant more? Well, as it's shown on this previous slide, we've got these trees spread around the property. And this is a lovely field, and we had a corner where those happens to be that planting is doing very, very well. As you can see, we've made the mistake here in this field of mowing, not leaving a buffer between the field and the forest, which isn't great for wildlife. So we're making a lot of adjustments there, and we're letting all of our fields grow back up over 5 or 6 years instead of mowing them every year to improve wildlife habitat. A big part of the program, the Family Forest Carbon Program, is the word family. So it's great that I'm into it, but then I've got a bunch of relatives and nieces and nephews and my daughters and my grandkids who are going to ultimately inherit the land. So when we talk about permanence, we talk about the other requirements with carbon programs, how you keep a family engaged in managing the forest to the standards that American Forest Foundation and Nature Conservancy are looking for. So every year, well, we've done it for 4 years, we have a tree planting weekend where the family comes together from across the country, and we dedicate that to planting as many trees as we can and looking at more diversity in what we're planting. The invasives I mentioned are in our southwest corner. You can see some strip cuts in the kind of lower left-hand corner. There's a lot of logging done up in that area back in 2015 and a few years before that, where the invasives are pretty invasive, pretty extensive. So we've got a grant to control those. We have some fairly recent patch cuts. The challenge with our patch cuts now is we're seeing both on our land and in state land that neighbors ours is the invasives come in pretty quickly. And so you see some recovery over on the right-hand side, but this is one of the areas that we treated with herbicides to try to prevent them from crowding out the regeneration in this area. Huge undertaking. I talked about the biodiversity on the land. Because we have about a 500-foot elevation gain, we have lots of different key environmental spots that we monitor pretty closely. So we have a number of locations, about 12 locations that we record data on an annual basis. So we do a forest inventory, wildlife inventory in those areas. This gives you a sense of, there's a good friend of some of ours named Ali Kasiba, who worked for the UVM extension and was formerly the Vermont climate forester. One of her key messages is you got to pay attention to the water on your land. And we have major erosion, as you can see from this picture. The top picture, that was about 15 feet wide 2 years ago. You can see how it's just slowly dismantling that field on the right-hand side. And then this right in the lower bottom, this was an old stream crossing that we'd used for 100 years. But through erosion, we can no longer access that. So we're putting in a small bridge. We put in a culvert earlier this last year, and within a month it was blown out because we didn't put in a large enough culvert. So keeping that soil on the ground, which is important for the forest, is essential. Engaging landowners, engaging family. We have a lot of events at the property, so we get the message out to as many people as possible. So that's a quick rundown of what we're doing. We're excited, really excited to be a part of the American Forest Foundation and Nature Conservancy's Family Forest Carbon Program. It's opened our eyes to a whole different way of looking at our land and what we can do to preserve it for the next generations. So it's been an exciting venture, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about this endeavor. Thank you for your time.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Tim. And Jim and Dan, I would invite you guys to hop back on screen if you'd like. So we have, so first off, thank you all for your presentations. I hope everyone enjoyed them. I know I learned a lot and really appreciate you guys joining us today and sharing your expertise and experiences. We have some prepared questions that we'll start working through. We've got a few in the Q&A that are open, and I think some of them may be addressed by things we're already planning to talk about, but we'll try to get to everything. But to kick it off, why now for these programs? What is it? I mean, I think we probably all kind of know, but if you wouldn't mind maybe each taking a stab at articulating that for Jim and Dan, like the programs that you're running, and Tim, I think you kind of hit on this already within your presentation, but if you want to say anything else about the timing and what it was that was really the trigger, that would be great. So I don't know. Whoever wants to
Absolutely.
start.
Oh, sure. No, I mean, I think the biggest reason why now is because we received a lot of funding from the USDA Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities grant. I mean, that was really truly the thing that springboarded us into being able to provide these programs. These programs that I presented on for NEF didn't really exist. We had other types of programs that we were implementing. These specific types of programs didn't exist and wouldn't exist without this funding. But certainly we were building off of decades of good research that NEF and other organizations were doing that showed that forests can be natural climate solutions. So without that sort of legwork beforehand, this also wouldn't be something that we could do. I think also that the people are starting to see that forestry as a necessity to address some of these climate implications of climate change is important. And so, for example, the presence of new forest health issues and recognizing that forestry can be a way to help sort of combat that is a good reason why we are doing this now.
Great. Jim, you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, so, we have a global climate crisis, and as Dan just said, nature can play a big role in that. We have years, not decades, to address this. We have a window of opportunity that's shrinking, and now is the time to act. Likewise, the state of Vermont, as well as the global community, have set goals to protect and improve the management of about 30% of the planet. The state of Vermont passed a law doing that, and part of that is like, not only do we need to protect that land, but we also want to make sure that that forest is in a good, healthy condition. And with all these private landowners out there, each making individual decisions and having different stressors on how they need to generate income from their forests or pass that on to their heirs, we believe that now is the time to give these opportunities to landowners through these financial incentives to improve the forestry.
Great.
And for me, there's a personal touch here, why we pursued the program. So I grew up on this farm. We lived all over New England, but we'd spend part of our summers there. And when I was in college, I spent a lot of time there. I haven't gone to Middlebury College. It's really near and dear to my heart. And I was very fortunate as a freshman in high school, if you can believe it, having a professor or teacher who was really into climate change this was in 1973, which dates
Oh,
me.
that's awesome.
So it was a long, and people go, we didn't know about climate change back then, but of course we did. My career was spent working for large utility companies, electric and gas around the country and in Canada, building a high level energy efficiency programs and some renewable programs. I retired from that about 6 years ago. And around that time, these programs came into being, and the focus on forest carbon reared its head. And recognizing that we have a huge responsibility as landowners, as Jim and Dan pointed out, landowners own about 80% of the land in northern New England. So we have a great deal of responsibility from my perspective to maintain what we have. A glorious part of where we live is then the expertise that we have throughout New England. So I'll embarrass Mike Snyder, but Mike's leadership and leadership from others of you on the call, Jim has been integral to this whole discussion, as is Kendra and Kendall. It's the resources are readily available to help landowners pursue this. So I think it just happened that a whole bunch of stars aligned at a time when climate change, we're seeing the impacts. I mean, we lost our key bridge to our house 10 years ago from a major storm. It's increased the cost of managing our land. It's a huge adjustment. So the first time ever, we're wondering, where are we going to get the money to rebuild road, rebuild bridges, reinforce barns and so forth under all this flooding. So that's another factor that came into our decision to pursue this.
Great. Let's see. I'm looking at our questions here. How do you determine eligibility for your program? I know, Jim and Dan, this is more a question for both of you, and you kind of have different landscape scales when it comes to, the types of programs you're running. But can you talk a little bit about how you determine eligibility and why you're focusing on that particular landowner and sort of land size, parcel size for your programs? And I don't really have Jim, you're unmuted, so why don't you kick that one up?
Yeah, so the way that we determined eligibility was we looked at really the two big major forest types here in New England. We looked at the oak hickory and we looked at the northern forest hardwood forest type, and then modeled out what the practices would do over what standard harvesting practices are in the region, and then look to see which ones we could get the biggest bump in carbon from. So that honed us in on the northern hardwood site, and then from there we looked at, you know, the 30-acre minimum as a threshold to get into the program. And then what's really important in this and able to show that we're generating additional carbon through this practice is we want to enroll properties that can be harvested, because we need to compare those against other properties that aren't enrolled that are also being harvested, to be able to show the difference in our practices, carbon storage and sequestration. So that's where those sort of, in my earlier slide there, the minimum thresholds for the stocking levels and everything that need to be there in order to be able to be enrolled. So that's how we came up with those. Is it was largely around a carbon calculation, and then how much could we generate that was financially viable. And I can get into the financial aspect of that, because I do see there's a couple of questions popping up, but we can come back to that.
Okay, yeah, well, I think we'll get back to that, but I do want to address, actually, our first question in the Q&A is just about where that program, which states that's being offered in right now. Because I think you showed a map of what, about 19 states, maybe?
Yeah, it's available in 19 states here in the region. It's all of New York, Western Massachusetts, those parts that have stands that are in northern hardwood forest, all of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. And we have not modeled out a practice for like spruce firs, so that those sites are not available. That's work that's underway but not completed yet. So those are the eligible states. And then I did see a question about payments in the comment, and just to get on that, that $300 payment is paid out over the span of the 20-year contract. 20% of that comes in the first year, and then 10% is in the last year, and the rest is spread over payments over the life of the contract.
Great. And you know what? I'm gonna ask you one more nut and bolt question
Yeah,
about
sure.
your program before I pick on Dan. I think it was, where is that one? So you presented two different programs. You have the Grow Older Forests and then Enhance Your Woodland. What's the split in terms of which program more people are enrolling in, or is it
Yeah. So
pretty
roughly my
equal?
data on that is from back in December. So we have, it should be pretty close. For those 4 states that are in the northern, or the 5 states that I just mentioned, about 64% is enrolled in Enhance Your Woodland. There's a very small portion, about 200 acres, that's enrolled in both. And then the remainder, 36%, is in Grow Old Forest. New York is skewing that number higher in growing older forest. When you pull, like, for instance, I looked at Vermont numbers here. In Vermont, 83% of the enrolled properties are in Enhance Your Woodland, and the remainder is in Grow Old Forest. So majority's in that, but there is a number that are, there is a fair size that are in the Grow Old Forest.
Okay, awesome. Well, Dan, to remind you what the original question was, because we took a little trip there. How did NEF determine eligibility for your programs? You talked about 2 different ones. They're much bigger, different scales, different geographies. What was that kind of decision process for your organization?
Right. Well, with the GROW program, which is the Grow Resilient Oak Hickory program, which, as a reminder, is really geared towards our small forest landowners and is available to folks in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. We set the acreage target at 25 acres in Massachusetts and Connecticut because I believe that's the minimum acreage amount that you have to be in current use. And so we felt like prioritizing that sort of size, parcel size, would be going into the bits of forest land that were most likely to have landowners who were maybe conservation minded, understood that there could be some management done on their land. And then we lowered it to 10 acres in Rhode Island just because you see a lot more smaller parcels owned by folks in that state. For our commercial landowner program, we really wanted to target commercial landowners because these are some of the landowners in New England that are implementing the types of climate smart forestry practices that we wanted to see happen at scale. They have staff that work year round, that have the expertise to do these practices. They have the labor connections with loggers. And in Maine, I know for sure, Maine puts together a nice civicultural activities report every couple of years. And what it shows is 84% of some of the non-commercial practices like pre-commercial thinning are done by landowners owning large amounts of acres. And so it just felt like a natural fit to sort of target that landowner group for an incentive program.
Okay, great. Let's see. I've seen at least a couple murmurings about funding, and people have some questions about how these programs are funded. So, Tim, you're welcome to participate in this one as well, but this is probably more for Dan and Jim, although I know you've got kind of a salad of funding sources helping out with your farm as well. So how are those programs funded? And whoever wants to jump on that one first, feel free.
You want to go first, Dan?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah, so both of our programs are funded by a USDA grant called the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. So not only the incentive payments to landowners, but the operational costs of implementing those programs are funded through this grant. Now, when it comes to the incentive payments, 30% of that payment is expected to come from some sort of private backing. So it's a match type program. 70% is paid out by the grant, 30% is paid by the landowner themselves. And so, we certainly are impacted. I'm seeing this in the question and answer columns. People are sort of referencing back to the funding freeze. So we are certainly impacted by that because this is a federal grant program. What we're doing right now is we're not stopping. I mean, we really see the value in this work. What hasn't changed is the fact that the climate emergency is out there, and we really feel like forest can be a climate solution. So, even though we're sort of awaiting guidance on whether that funding freeze will be lifted, we're still enrolling people in the program. We're still processing paperwork. We're still going through those environmental reviews. It's a lot easier to just kind of maintain the speed at which we're trying to get these programs off the ground rather than just stop and try to reboot it later. So, it's something that we still see the value in, and we're still forging ahead on.
Excellent. Yeah, I know that's a little bit of a loaded question right now. Jim, can you address how your programs are funded?
Yeah, we do have a grant from the Climate Smart Commodities program as well, and that's the one that's providing the incentive payments. They're paying a little bit extra for folks that are willing to enroll in NRCS and have their, set up their track number and do that. The majority of the money that is going into family forest carbon right now is coming from private philanthropic sources and corporate sources. So the way this program is set up is we are making these payments in advance of the credits being generated because we have to wait to see how they stack up against common practice before we claim that there's a carbon benefit there. So a number of companies and foundations have they've put money into sort of priming the pump so that we can make those payments and get the program going. And then the program will be funded as we sell those credits. We've done a number of credit sales to companies ahead of time. They'll offtake those credits when they become available. There's a big auction coming up in a week or so where we'll be putting additional credits out there in the marketplace and testing the price on those. And then to get to that point, I know that oftentimes people are like, well, who's buying, so you mentioned that, and who are these companies? Some of them are companies like REI and others. We vet all of these companies. We put them through a screening for, what is their climate goals as a corporation? How are they what are their plans to get to net zero? And, are they doing everything they can to reduce their carbon footprint before they even get to using the credits to cover those things that we can't mitigate yet due to technology or the lack of, alternative transportation, things like that. We also look at their record for for human rights, things like that. And we do not sell the credits to the fossil fuel sector or mining sectors. So there are certain companies that are we just don't sell those credits there.
Great. Well, thank you for hitting two questions because I was going to interject that one if you didn't get to it. So appreciate that. Tim, do you want to talk a little bit about the funding sources that you've tapped into?
Just
Round it out.
Just to add, just to add to Jim and Dan's comments, I think one of the exciting parts of these programs is the level of focus on what is now called in the market high integrity forest carbon credits. And as probably everyone on this call knows, there have been a lot of forest carbon projects internationally that have gotten a bad rap because there wasn't seemed to be any additionality. To address that, there's a heavy focus across the world in improving the integrity of the forest, of the carbon credits. So there's a lot of money going into that. One of the Nature Conservancy and AFF's approaches to that is to have potential purchasers pay part of the credits upfront so that the work can go into evaluating the projects in much greater detail. So that's a huge part of this auction, credit auction that Jim mentioned, was that the focus is on getting large corporations, other organizations to provide funding in advance so we can just have much higher integrity in the carbon credits that are being generated. So I think that's my funding comes from Family Forest Carbon and NRCS. That's where the bulk of it comes from.
Great. Thank you guys. Kind of, zoom back out a little bit in terms of your programs and just ask, how are they going? How is what has the interest been? How is enrollment? Have there been any challenges that you've encountered that maybe surprised you? I know there's a lot in there, but yeah, be interested just to hear how things are going.
We're excited with the interest that's cropped up, when we put this out as a pilot in Vermont and eastern New York and Massachusetts. Quite honestly, the number of Vermont landowners was a bit overwhelming. I would say our challenge has been getting that backlog of folks that have expressed interest synced up with a forester or getting, reviewing their paperwork and all that. So it's we're working through that, but I think things are getting better now. We have more foresters on staff at both organizations, and we have more contracted foresters, and we're improving the system so that, if we don't need to go and visit the property because there's a good valid management plan there, we can move forward. So those are, there've been some growing pains there, but I think in some ways those are good growing pains because it shows that there's a strong interest in the program, which is encouraging to me that landowners want to be doing the right thing and want to contribute to solving these problems.
Oh, that's great. Sounds like good problems to have, Jim.
Yeah.
Dan, how about for the NEF programs?
I think our programs are going well. For the GROW program, which is our small forest landowner program, having officially launched December 6th, we're seeing good, consistent interest in that. We're starting to take people through the environmental review process. So one thing I didn't mention is that with our programs, they're tied to RCS standards. So producers who are enrolling and expect to get an incentive payment are tied to all the sort of NEPA requirements that come with getting and receiving federal funds. And so part of that is providing technical assistance. NEF is providing that technical assistance to take them through that environmental review process. So we're getting good, consistent interest in that program. With our commercial program, it's not just open enrollment. We decided to roll that out through a couple of different phases. We've launched the first phase, which we called our design phase. Because this program didn't exist until we had this grant, we had to go through sort of a proof of concept with the landowners to figure out how this was going to work with them. And when we launched that first round one, we had 6 landowners interested in working with us, knowing that they were going to have to put a lot of time and energy into helping us figure out how this was going to look. So we're really encouraged. We're about a year into that first design phase. We're hoping to have practices on the ground this summer, and certainly this fall. So with that first round one, we had 12,000 acres sort of pledged to implement climate smart forestry practices on from our total 40,000 acre goal with commercial landowners. So I think enrollment is good, and yeah, we're excited about it.
Great. Tim, anything you'd like to add? I know your program, you're kind of here with a slightly different perspective, but
Yeah. Just 2 things I'd point out. One, when some of these programs were a few others 4 years ago that popped up, but I'd say 4 or 5 years ago there weren't a whole lot of foresters who, and I have to be really careful how I say this, but there was a lot of skepticism around, all right, can you quantify the carbon in a forest and with integrity? I think there's a lot more comfort. There's some great organizations in New England that have really worked hard to get the message out about the value of forest carbon. So I think the forestry community, not surprising at all, has really grabbed hold of this. There are a lot more foresters who have spent time learning about how to evaluate carbon. So the foundation that Jim and Dan and I and others need to grow these programs, that's gaining a lot of momentum and is very encouraging. The second thing I'd mention is, I think because of this focus on forest carbon, there are a lot more landowners who, and I get this question all the time from landowners, well, why do I need to participate in a program? I don't want money going to those big corporations. And I always tell them, you can still manage your land for carbon. Just have more of a slant in your land use plan on climate change. Ask your forester to look, factor in carbon. And that's been done over the years, but there's a much more rigorous approach to it. So you don't necessarily need to participate in the program if you have objections to the whole credit field. You can still manage your land to specifics so that you are building your carbon sink. So I think those are 2 very encouraging trends.
excellent. I'm kind of jumping around here on our questions, but I think this one kind of fits in well at this point. So I want to talk a little bit about metrics for success for your programs, because Tim, you mentioned the difficulty in potentially measuring carbon in a forest. And so, one of the common critiques I think that comes up with carbon markets is that question of additionality and sort of how do you actually show that you're increasing carbon over stored carbon over a baseline sort of scenario. So can any of you speak to, either trends you're seeing kind of nationally or regionally within that sort of question, and then more specifically, what tools you're using to verify the lands in your programs are actually doing what you are hoping that they're doing?
As far as additionality goes, the way that we had a lot of conversations on how to handle that. That's a tough topic, and I think what we settled on, at least for our commercial landowner program, was to view it in the sense of acres treated as being additional. So if there's a specific climate smart forestry practice that we're promoting, it could be something like commercial thinning or crop tree release, could be anything. As if the landowner could show us that in the past 3 years, they've on average implemented that practice over a certain amount of acres, and what we're paying for is in addition to what they would normally do. We don't want to pay for what they're already doing. We would view that as additional. So kind of a sort of specific way to handle the additionality challenge when it comes to carbon. One of the ways that we're verifying that the practices were done is we're going out into the field, and in fact, it's part of our grant. It was a mandate by USDA to have some sort of verification that these practices were done before you make the payment. So when you're talking about paying for some sort of active forest management, the payment actually gets in the hands of the landowner in our scenarios after they've put up time and money to do it, and we go out and verify that it was done accurately. So in that way, it's a true reimbursement.
Okay, great. Jim?
Yeah, so we're very proud of the way that we're measuring additionality. We that was one of the things when we set out was to find a new, better ways to measure that, because in the traditional market approach, you kind of model out a potential scenario where you would maximize the profit, the profits from that forest, and then you would measure your plan against that hypothetical baseline. This is very different in this one. We aggregate the properties that are enrolled each year. Each one of these properties has monitoring sites put on them, so we can go out and measure those, and they're selected on a random basis each year to match up. What we do is we match the enrolled properties with similar properties that are in the forest inventory assessment database that the U.S. Forest Service has. And we have great coverage here in the Northeast. It's updated regularly. And we find those compatible properties, and there's about 13 different variables, something like that, to match those properties. And then we watch the two go. So as that property that's enrolled, as their carbon builds up on there, we compare it to what happens in that matched property, and the difference between those two is what becomes available as carbon credits per ton kind of calculation that will be available to be sold. So it's variable. One year might be a lot, other years it might be less. There's a chance that everybody adopts great practices and there's no carbon additionality. So that's part of the risk that this program's undertaking. And so we measure that way. And so that's how we're really trying to show, that's one of our measures of success is, how much carbon we're storing as a result of people enrolling in this program. And that's how we're doing it. The methodology itself is in the it's a Vera protocol. It's Vera 45, Improved Forest Management, if you want to go look it up and get into the real weedy details of it. But that's the approach we're doing it. And then the other, quite honestly, metrics of success we're looking for are the acres enrolled, right? We want to see as much of this enrolled as possible. We want to see that landowners ultimately renew these contracts or continue on with their great management going forward. So we see this as a journey together with the landowners over decades. The 20-year contract was established because it was a period of time that most landowners can kind of wrap their head around, and it's less than perpetuity. 100 years seems very long, and even 40 years is a time. So those are the way we're measuring success. And then from the businesses that we engage with, one of the other measures of success that we have is that they become advocates as well for addressing the climate crisis. So it's not just a financial exchange with them, it's an exchange of shared goals and a shared willingness to tackle this challenging problem we have.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that. And I think you kind of hit one of the questions that was in the Q&A too about that time period. So thanks for wrapping that in. I did want to ask you guys both also about permanence as like sort of another piece of your programs. And I think you already kind of covered this, Jim, but you know, what happens at the end of this 20 years? You know, 20 years is a long time in human time, or feels like it, but it's a pretty short amount of time in tree time. So, you know, kind of what are those tensions and, you know, and sort of what's the hope that you know, how does that happen? You know, what happens if the land switches ownership, or if whoever, yeah, I think the ownership is probably,
Yeah.
stickiest situation, but yeah, anything you
Yeah,
want
so
to add to that piece?
yeah, let me take a stab at it. So permanence, yes, 20 years is just a little blink of an eye in a forest's perspective, and our trees do grow slow. So the 20-year contract, you know, our hope is that we're building a long-term relationship with these landowners so that when they go, you know, when it comes up next time around, we're there to help them find additional financing or, you know, work with them to renew the contract. So there's that. It's the hope of the future and a future that's working together. We look at permanence also by the fact that, you know, we continue to enroll properties so that at any one time there is a, you know, we put a portion of those credits into a buffer pool if anything goes wrong. But the rest of them, it's sort of a stacked approach so that there's a building cascade of credits that are secured over time. And then, yes, the contract does run with the land. So if you enroll and you sell your property 5 years later, that contract stays with that property. It's attached to it's a notice on the deed that's there. And then I did see a question about getting at the other permanence around permanent conservation. This does not preclude a landowner from enrolling in like forest legacy or other putting a permanent easement on their property, as long as that easement doesn't restrict the forest management or pays them for those credits as a part of the easement. So easements are compatible with this program, either pre or post enrollment.
Right. Dan?
Yeah, you know, you're bringing up some of the terms that are commonly associated with the carbon credit systems and, you know, additionality, permanence. The other one is leakage. Our programs aren't really tied to any sort of carbon accreditation and crediting standard. We don't get involved in the carbon credit market with our programs. You know, that doesn't mean we try to ignore those big questions, and they're really hard questions to answer. The way that we address permanence was by having a contract term. NRCS has contract tails on the end of practices that they support. We do the same thing. Unfortunately, you know, I'll admit some people might think that these are small contract terms. 10 years is what we typically put on. The reason it is short in our instance is because we're funded up until 2028, right? So we're not, this is funding from the government for a period of time to implement these programs, pilot them, see what works. And so that's what we realistically felt like we could do. I'd like to just address leakage though too. Leakage is this idea that if you're not harvesting somewhere, it's going to be harvested somewhere else. And so if you have a landowner where you ask them to do more passive management and they're harvesting less than they could, that is going to leak somewhere else in New England, somewhere else in the United States, maybe even globally. The way we're trying to address leakage is that we're trying to maintain harvest levels. So especially with our commercial landowners, we're trying to increase the in forest carbon that is being sequestered and stored in the forest while also maintaining harvest levels. And that might not be able to be done in a short period of time, but we're trying to figure out what that length of time is to sort of create that scenario where hopefully these types of programs can almost be self-sustaining.
Excellent. Tim, anything to add? There was one relatively hefty question that I kind of wanted to get to, 'cause I think it might generate some discussion, but is there anything you'd like to add to, kind of any of those pieces from your perspective?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is I mentioned this briefly in the beginning, is the importance of getting as much family involved in understanding the program as possible. So there may be a champion in a family. 20 years to a family to us was a long time. There are a number of family members who are like, really, we're going to commit ourselves to 20 years? What happens to you, Tim, if you were to evaporate? Who's going to take the leadership on this? So I think the education, and I think the Family Forest Carbon Program has done a good job of this, is having forums where more family can learn what it involves, why it's so important, that there is a 20-year commitment. How do we embrace that? So I think it's that, for longevity of the program, it's really important to have a number of champions throughout the generations who can help shepherd these programs going forward. So I'll stop there.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we have time for one more before I have some housekeeping I have to get to. So I'm just going to read this question so it's a little bit long. I want to make sure I get the whole thing. So there's sometimes a misperception that managing for carbon is incompatible with managing for fiber or timber. Also, or that carbon is the only forest product we should be using forests for given the climate crisis. Both are incorrect in my opinion. How are you running into these perceptions in your work, and how do you talk about the balance of managing for multiple objectives alongside carbon? Don't all go at once.
A forest is a dynamic living ecosystem, and you can't, just like with your own bodily health, you don't just, look at, the temperature of your forehead or the bone density. You've got to look at it holistically. Carbon is an important element here, and what we're trying to do is elevate its importance in terms of our thinking about the contributions it can have for natural climate solutions. But it can't be the only way to manage a forest, and that's why we've built these practices, not just around storing and sequestering carbon, but we built off of things like Audubon's, silvicultural for the birds and other information that's out there about how do we improve habitat and address things like invasives in our forests. So they're very compatible with those goals, and I don't think it's an either or. It's very much of an and situation, and that we have solutions here that can address, these little gap creations can be great for wildlife. They can be great for creating structural diversity and all of those things that are important to have in the forest. So I think that's how we're trying to address the problem. Is it's not, there are, forever wild type of easements or conditions that will add carbon, but those should be applied in places that are, specific to the needs of the landscape, and then look for ways to allow landowners to have resources to keep holding the forest as forest.
Great. And Dan, I know you already took a stab at answering this with the typing, but if there's anything you want to add,
well,
or even just reiterate what
appreciate,
you had to say.
yes, I have a link in there too, so people can even take a little bit of a deeper dive if they like. And I really appreciate the question, because I think it's true that there probably is a misconception that managing for carbon is incompatible with managing for fiber or timber, which I think isn't true, and the science kind of proves out that it's not true. And the way we face this, I think maybe one of the best examples we face this is in our programs where we're supporting climate smart forestry with small forest landowners. And I mean, you see this all over New England, but in particularly in some of the southern New England states. And when we're working with municipalities who have that added responsibility of showing what they're doing is responsible, because these are public lands, they do face this sort of the term is proforestation, right? Or just people that are just generally concerned about what is going on there. And so you have to sort of walk through the science and the justification of of why you're doing what you're doing. So every time we support a project like that, it gives us a stage and opportunity to share more about what climate smart forestry is and how these things are not incompatible.
Excellent. Tim, I'll give you a chance for anything you'd like to
Yeah.
just wrap up with, and then I'll wrap up.
Yeah, no, I think Jim and Dan have touched on everything, so I'm fine.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you all three of you. I really appreciate you spending an hour and a half of your Thursday. It's Thursday, right? Thursday midday with me and with our audience. I'd also like to thank the U.S. Forest Service for their support of this webinar series. Kendall, my compatriot here that has been hiding off screen but running the show for us will be sending out a email to follow up on this to everyone who has registered. That's going to include the link to the recording for the webinar, which will also be posted on our website probably within the next week or so. Any resources that our presenters may want to share with you all, and if there's anything maybe that you asked for in the Q&A or the chat, we can try to include that stuff. And also information on registration for our next webinar. We don't have a date for that yet, but it's going to be hosted by our community investment team, and it's going to be on municipal strategies for managing short-term rentals. So we hope you can join us for that next month. That would be lovely. We're also hiring. So if you are interested in being our next donor and investment relations officer, we would love to hear from you. Or if you have any friends that you think would be a good fit for that position, please share this as widely as you feel comfortable. We're really looking for another dynamic and wonderful teammate. Lastly, we'd love to encourage you, if you haven't already, to sign up for our news digest. This is a great way to keep up on news from around the Northern Forest region and also any upcoming webinars. So I think that's it for housekeeping. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope to see many of you on a future webinar or as I get to know the Northern Forest region and travel around and meet folks. So thanks again and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Kendra.
Take care.